There are some things that I really like about Reignbreaker, and because of that, it almost succeeds in being a good game. Almost. But there are so many things here and there that felt frustrating or incomplete, and because of that, it was ultimately disappointing to me. So let's get into it. Reignbreaker is an action roguelite that, like so many others, draws clear inspiration from Hades. It's set in a cyberpunk world where you're setting out to search the Bastion and destroy the Queen of Keys. The combat itself starts out with a fairly basic moveset. For attacks, you have a punch, a javelin throw, and a javelin ground smash. You also have a dash and accompanying sprint. Later on, you can also gain a different punch moveset or a second javelin melee strike attack. Moveset variety comes in the form of different javelins. Each different javelin has mostly the same core moveset, but with different effects for that javelin based on the bayonet. For example, all javelins had the same ground smash, but one bayonet causes the ground javelin to shoot out attacks all around it, while another causes the javelin to have a tornado attack spawn around it. Further, different variants of each javelin have different passives, like applying a condition effect or debuff on hit. At the most basic level, this moveset Reignbreaker is functional and familiar. If you played other action roguelites, you can pick it up pretty quickly, but there are some occasional moments that can feel a little clunky. The javelin throw can be charged, and also has a crit mechanic if tossed with precise timing. In a unique mechanic to the Reignbreaker, as you use more javelin attacks, your javelin will very quickly overheat. When your javelin overheats, you can actually still use it, but the accompanying bayonet attack stops working. So you can still throw it, but you won't get that tornado on hit, for example. This means a pretty sizable damage decrease when overheated. You can reduce your heat with punches, certain upgrades, or by simply waiting for it to decay naturally. This overheating mechanic itself was interesting in a way that I liked. It forced you to balance your more powerful attacks with either a cooldown in the form of waiting for that natural heat drain, or it could force you to be more aggressive by punching enemies with that melee attack. There are also a lot of upgrades that modify the heat as well as a nice build crafting element. This overheating mechanic was also my first frustration point with Reignbreaker and made me almost refund the game on my first run. Your character spams an annoying voice line constantly when you use a javelin attack that's overheated. I thought my game was fundamentally bugged because my character kept saying, I can't use the javelin, when I clearly could use the javelin. I eventually realized that it's just the bayonet effects that are inactive. The javelin itself is fine. This was doubly annoying because some mechanics encourage the use of overheated javelins, meaning that I was often spammed with this voice line due to how the game forced me to interact with it. It feels like at one point in development, you couldn't use overheated javelins at all. They later changed that mechanic without changing the underlying voice lines. There's no tutorial for these mechanics, which is fine, but the contradictory voice line makes things more confusing. It made me feel like the game had a glaring bug when I first started playing it. Another unique combat mechanic for Reignbreaker comes in the form of the finisher. Some enemies require a finishing move in order to actually be defeated. If you don't finish them in time, they can often respawn. Different upgrades can interact with that finisher, making it a potential build crafting element as well. Reignbreaker also has a combo bar where you'll deal more damage as you hit more enemies without taking damage yourself. This finisher and combo meter adds some nice flavor to the game and help make it stand out a little bit more among an increasingly crowded action roguelite space. Builds in Reignbreaker have three main parts. First are the different javelins that I mentioned that have slightly different movesets and notably different bayonet effects. Second are upgrades from the vaults you find during your run. These upgrades are similar to boons in Hades and belong to one of 4 different characters or vault types. Some of these upgrades are more basic, like increased max health, while others are more substantial, like allowing your javelin slam attack to be charged up for more damage, or making finishing enemies with that finisher stack bleed on other enemies nearby. I think the upgrades that do exist are interesting, and there's certainly a lot of fun builds you can make, like one that makes basic attack, those punches, a lot more powerful, or ones that spawn a ton of traps that deal a lot of damage and stun enemies. But at the same time, the build crafting felt very limited with only 4 upgrades or 4 vault types. Each of these 4 vault types have decent amount of variety within themselves, usually 2 or more different categories of upgrades, but altogether, it just feels unfinished and disappointing. Between 2 runs, I would often be offered many of the same options, and I would find myself often running small variants on the same overall build. There just aren't enough upgrade options for you to not get some repetition, too much repetition, run to run. The third and final build crafting element comes in the form of pre-run upgrades, which I'm going to call relics for better distinguishing. You can unlock and level up these relics by spending Resolve, a cross-run currency that I'll talk about later on. And you unlock more relic slots to equip more relics as you get more wins. I think the system is a very interesting idea. It's designed to fuse more straightforward unlock systems, like an additional melee attack set for the javelin, with more common Hades-like relic systems, where you can only equip one at each time. And in theory, the system gives you a lot more choice over what you actually care about. And it could make compelling trade-offs around what niche relics are worth taking over more powerful general buffs. For example, one relic gives you that additional javelin strike moveset, while another one allows you one resurrection if you die. But while interesting in theory, in practice, it just felt like it was so much more optimal to take the boring but powerful buffing relics and to never take those niche but potentially more interesting or fun relics. For example, I basically never took the Javelin Strike relic because it was kind of redundant. There are already melee punches and a melee Javelin Slam, as well as the overheating mechanic preventing more widespread Javelin Strike use anyway. Similarly, you can unlock the ability to swap between two Javelins at once, but I rarely did that. Relics like an additional revive just felt way more important, especially early on when relic slots are more limited. But that also meant I effectively optimized myself out of more fun moveset variety. Basically, there was often a choice between being more powerful and having more playstyle variety, and that wasn't a particularly satisfying or enjoyable choice to make. One element I did quite like in Reignbreaker was the unique map design. Unlike a lot of action roguelites where you clear one room, then another, each level in Reignbreaker is a large openish world. In each map, you can find wandering enemies, merchant, loot statues, and vaults. Those vaults are what give you those important run upgrades or buffs. Activating a vault spawns an enclosed wave-based encounter that's more similar to the genre standard, with vaults occasionally having an extra modifier like a time limit or needing to take no damage while killing the enemies. Importantly, you don't usually have to clear every single vault in order to progress to the next level. You can also skip all the extra stuff like hunting for merchants or bashing cabinets to get more keys and resolve. The map also has ample traps that are usually fairly easy to manipulate in order to damage enemies. Overall, the level design is a nice mix of openish world elements and closed encounters. There are times where you stand and fight, and times you can run past enemies and just keep moving. My only complaint here is that enemies can attack you in the open world before you can even see them. So sometimes you just run into off-screen projectiles from enemies that you just haven't seen yet. Not super common, but still annoying when it happens. As some niche gameplay odds and ends, the game has a super short invulnerability window when you're hit. I actually thought originally that you had no invulnerability, but some upgrades modify it, so it must exist in some form. This means that you can take a lot of hits in a row and take a lot of damage. Unfortunately, enemy hits also give you a momentary stun, so if you're chained attacks by certain enemies, you can effectively get stun locked briefly and take a huge chunk of damage. It just doesn't feel good, even if you can eventually learn to adapt and better avoid those specific combos that stun lock you. The Javelin Throw also has heavy-handed aim assist. This was mostly fine, but sometimes it just wouldn't latch onto certain targets. I found this mostly happened if an enemy was against the wall or partially occluded by a wall, but it also almost never targeted the smaller, speedy sphere enemies. Again, another minor annoyance that impacted the gameplay. I did also encounter some minor bugs here and there, like the time when my javelin disappeared visually for a little while. Gameplay-wise, there were also one or two bayonet effects that I thought were bugged for a while. Namely one that triggers when enemies are nearby, but doesn't include the actual enemy that you hit with the javelin for some reason. I'm still not sure if that's intentional or not, whether as like a trap effect or whether it just doesn't recognize the enemy for some reason. I also feel like I had some low frame rate or background stuttering at times. I'm not really sure what's up with that. Finally, I did try this game on Steam Deck, and it ran perfectly fine there as well. So as a whole, the gameplay in Reignbreaker has a great skeleton, and when it all comes together, it can be pretty fun. It was satisfying to clear all these enemies, and I loved all of the bosses. But there are so many gameplay friction points and things that just don't quite work out how I would hope they would. It felt like every time I got into the flow of the game, I was enjoying it, some friction point would take me out of it and leave me frustrated. Now let's talk about variety and randomness in Reignbreaker. While most roguelites have the same run length and structure every run, Reignbreaker is more akin to Isaac or Neon Abyss. Each run changes the bosses, the enemies available, and how long the run is. Starting out, enemy variety is pretty bad, honestly, with only like 5 enemy types. But as you win more runs, you unlock more enemy types, including former bosses that become standard enemies. I think the enemy variety at the start is not very good, but I think once you get to the later runs and actually unlock all the enemy types and variants, it's perfectly fine. But it's also nothing impressive at the same time. Initially, your runs are just one area with the final boss, but you progress to having 3 areas with the final boss at the end of each. While the bosses are different, each area has the exact same design. Same possible map layouts, same aesthetic, and same possible enemies. It just feels bad variety-wise compared to other action roguelites that do have more variety between areas, and it makes it feel incomplete, like they never got around to adding those later areas, so they just copied that starting area and pasted it later on. You also unlock 4 enemy health variants, including notably one that damages you if you punch enemies, and one that negates thrown damage on those enemies. In theory, this is a decent way to add more enemy variety without adding new types of enemies. And I guess it does that mostly here, but these variants were often frustrating in the actual implementation. For starters, some enemies getting the no-throw buff made them a lot harder to kill. Ultimately, that's fine because it did change how I approached them, but more importantly, the no-punch modifiers just didn't feel fun at all, especially because enemies often clumped together, so having a single enemy that was no-punch meant that you couldn't punch any of them without triggering it. This also means that javelins will inevitably overheat in those situations because you're forced to use the javelins again and again, which triggers that annoying voice line spam that I talked about earlier, despite being either required to use the javelin or just not attack and wait for that heat level to decrease. And most annoying of all, enemies spawn in with these effects, but they don't visually load in the effects until a couple seconds later. So you can start attacking the enemy only to be stunned and damaged because, surprise, it's an anti-punch enemy, but the info wasn't shown to you yet. Like a lot of other small frustration points in Reignbreaker, it's just one of those things that brought me out of the game when I started to get a nice groove and I started to enjoy it. One last complaint with these health variants: poor color choices. Why are 2 modifiers both different shades of blue? And why are some modifiers, like the vampiric one, so similar to the red-based health color? It just makes differentiation a little bit harder than it needs to be, which is doubly weird because this game is otherwise so colorful and vibrant. So, as I've said at other points, good ideas for enemy variety, but the execution itself feels incomplete and unfinished. I've already talked about how the upgrades in general lack variety. Mainly there just needs to be more than 4 upgrade types that are offered. 2 other things worth mentioning. First, each possible upgrade has 4 or 5 different rarities, which means improved stats like increased base health for that upgrade, and each upgrade can also be leveled up later on, which, like improved rarities, increases those base stats. There is an RNG element here to whether you get lucky with more powerful variants or rarities of upgrades, but it's also balanced out by the ability to effectively get the same result by leveling up those upgrades later on. Second, this game does offer counter RNG measures in the form of those relics you can equip before your run. For example, one relic makes Plague Doctor vaults a lot more likely to spawn, as well as increasing the rarity of Plague Doctor upgrades when you get them. But because this is a relic, equipping it comes at the cost of those more powerful upgrades, so I basically never did this type of counter RNG custom build crafting. All these build mechanics add some nice variety run to run and give some degree of control as well, but they don't solve that core build crafting variety problem. Runs start to feel very similar because it feels like you're always getting some of that same core mix of upgrades from each of the 4 vaults. Really, for me, Reignbreaker fails to deliver on the 2 main sources of variety. It only has okay enemy variety, but it's worsened by things like that no-punch modifier that did add variety, but just weren't fun. It also had poor build crafting variety, and it just felt like I was always running small variants of the same overall builds. And I also completely forgot to mention the javelins in my draft of this section, because they also had basically the same base moveset with slightly different bayonet effects that usually were some variant of an AoE attack as well. It just feels like they could have done a lot more there. Progression in Reignbreaker comes in 2 main systems, as well as the overarching run progression. So first comes that run progression structure that I talked about earlier, where each win until you're 6th changes the enemies, the length of the run, things like that. Annoyingly, your run high scores count both complete and incomplete runs. So my permanent run high score is just one of those 2 shorter 1 area runs that I won. Yeah, it's not the biggest deal, but add it to this list of things that felt incomplete in Reignbreaker for me. There are also no normal difficulty levels that I found, so once you beat that 6th run, which I did in about 7 hours, there's no more scaling challenges for me, besides starting a new save, I guess. Unlocks-wise, you get a cross-run currency in the form of Resolve you can use for leveling up and unlocking relics. Each relic sits in one of 3 relic trees. Relics are unlocked and leveled up by spending Resolve, which then allows you to unlock and level up future relics within each skill tree. This is a pretty familiar system, and the game is pretty generous with Resolve from clearing bosses and statues, so the unlocks have a nice pacing there. My only complaint with the unlocks here is my Roguelite pet peeve, where there's a relic that increases Resolve gain. I always hate choosing between faster progression and within run power. I actually don't think it's that bad here though, but it did mean that I had this Resolve relic often equipped instead of more fun ones. And as I've already talked about, that kind of choice has already limited some of the fun that I've had with this game. Javelins also had to be unlocked. These are mostly unlocked by completing certain challenges, like a level within a certain time window or beating certain bosses for the first time, but you could also find others by just exploring the maps. Like a lot of things in Reignbreaker for me, the time challenges to unlock javelins were just a little frustrating in how they were implemented. At their core, they incentivize you to skip parts of the area, and therefore skipping more loot and more upgrades within that run in order to get better time instead. I think that's ultimately fine as a one-time unlock, which they mostly are. But each of these 6 or 7 run variants have different time thresholds for each of their areas in a way that felt inconsistent. So you might have to beat 5 minutes for the first area, but then later on that same area needs to be cleared in under 4 minutes. Another area went from 5 minutes to 10 minutes. But there was no indication of that time threshold until after you cleared an area. So despite learning time threshold in earlier versions of the same area, they were not reliable because they would sometimes change as you got more wins. I would skip vaults and upgrades to meet a certain time threshold, only to realize that I had actually missed a new unknown time threshold that was different. I also don't know if I permanently just missed certain javelins because they were time threshold challenges for certain run types that I moved past. For example, I didn't unlock all the javelins for win number 3, but once I got to win 4, 5, and 6, I don't think there was a way to go back and win them. Maybe they show up later on somehow, but I'm not even sure how to tell if that's true. So here again, Reignbreaker has some good core systems, but it just doesn't feel like they ironed out all of the kinks. There are a decent amount of unlocks for those that want that, but I was quickly left with no challenge to strive for and no reason to keep progressing. Reignbreaker has a pretty sizable amount of narrative elements for a roguelite. The overarching plot involves you playing as Clef, a former member of this elite force of the Queen of Keys. The Queen herself acts as an authoritarian dictator who controls the masses via televised propaganda. Along your runs, you encounter different characters, which includes all the 4 characters that have the different vault types or the upgrades you collect, a couple of different side characters, things like that. All of this dialogue between Clef and the other characters has full voice acting. Most of the voice acting is fine, but some is definitely not as great, and I can hear some microphone limitations as well. As for the story itself, it has a nice arc as a whole, with some interesting reveals. Because of that, I did enjoy it as a whole, but it also lacks a lot of deeper substance, namely, there isn't as much backstory for all the characters as I would want. They hint at deeper things going on, which helps make the story decent, but they never fully expand to make that story truly satisfying. It's still a better story than most roguelites, but nonetheless, not a game I'd recommend for the story alone. I'll also add that I generally love the aesthetic of this game, which is one of the reasons I purchased it originally. There's a nice lock and key animation for the finisher, and a nice unique cyberpunk theme with a mix of medieval elements and spray paint. They also have a fun collab with the Norwegian metal band that provided the soundtrack for the game. All these elements surrounding the game were great, and they made me want to really like the game despite my frustrations. So, what's my verdict on Reignbreaker? There were some good pieces of Reignbreaker. It has a nice environment and aesthetic. It has interesting mechanics like the overheating javelin and the level design, and it has nice core building blocks to create fun builds. At the same time, though, the game has a ton of small to medium-sized elements that are frustrating and repeatedly took me out of that satisfying flow state. And along with that, so many elements here and there felt unfinished and half-baked, like the build variety or the map and enemy variety. If it was an early access release, I think it'd be one thing, because this core skeleton could definitely be expanded upon and made into something great. But as a full 1.0 release, I just can't recommend Reignbreaker unless you want to just play something new for a couple hours before moving on to something else. Unfortunately, while they are still doing bug fixes and similar things, there's no actual content updates for Reignbreaker because the studio is being shut down by the publisher. Huge shout out to all our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.